This is the first of a three-part video series on writing about literature, MLA standards, and best practices for quoting and documenting sources. This first video is about mechanics. So we're going to talk a lot about punctuation in this video. So we'll start with quotation marks and parenthetical citations. If you don't know what these things are yet, whenever you copy a writer's exact words into your essay, make sure to identify those words using opening and closing quotation marks. You note that serif fonts like Times New Roman quotation marks both open, that is, they face to the right, and they close, they face to the left. This sometimes creates problems. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Direct quotations usually end with a parenthetical citation that comes after the closing quotation marks. Inside the parentheses, you will identify the source of the quotation, typically by the author's last name only, followed by the page number or page numbers from which the quote was taken. You do not need to abbreviate page with a P or PP period, and ordinarily a comma after the author's name is not necessary. Now, there are exceptions to the last name rule and the comma rule, but they're very rare, and we'll talk about those in the third part of this series. So here's an example of a typical quote. I've highlighted the quotes in yellow. You'll notice that they open and close, and the parenthetical citation is highlighted in blue. I've opened it up a little bit there, zoomed in a bit. Pay attention to the spacing around the quotation marks and parenthetical citation. There's a space between the closing quotation marks and the first parenthesis of the parenthetical citation, and the terminal punctuation comes after the closing parenthesis. So take a look at the parenthetical citation here. You might pause here and read this carefully and determine whether or not it is correct or incorrect. The answer is that it is correct. So in this example, because the writer introduced the quote using the author's name, she does not have to include the name in the parenthetical citation. The page number alone is sufficient. Similarly, if you insert multiple quotes from the same source, you do not have to repeat the author's name after the first parenthetical citation. Here's an example of that. Got two quotes in the same paragraph. I've highlighted the quotes in yellow. My parenthetical citations are highlighted in blue. And I do not need to put Anderson's name in the second parenthetical citation. However, in situations where you quote from multiple sources, you want to make sure it is clear to the reader which is which by including a full parenthetical citation every time you switch sources. So here's an example where I quote Anderson twice, but in between those two quotes from Anderson, I have a quotation from someone else, someone named Love, Glenn Love, who wrote the introduction to the book that I was using here. And the introduction was also paginated using Roman numerals. So if you look at my citation, I use Roman numerals as they do in the book. So for similar reasons, whenever you start a new paragraph, you should always identify the source in the first parenthetical citation, even if it is the same as the last citation in the previous paragraph. So hypothetically here, I ended the paragraph quoting Anderson. There's my parenthetical citation, the first one there. And then I start a new paragraph and I quote Anderson again, but because it's a new paragraph, I go ahead and repeat inserting his last name. If a source is not paginated, and I'm talking mainly about secondary sources here, not primary sources like literary texts, which we'll talk about in the third video in this series, But like a website or a web page, the author's name is all you need to include in your parenthetical citation. If the author has already been named, you do not need to include a parenthetical citation at all. So here are a couple of examples where I write, some television critics acknowledge that television writers are using a traditional horror taboo like cannibalism to paint a bigger picture of American social anxieties. I did not identify the author, so I went ahead and put the author's name in my parenthetical citation, but it's a website, so there's no page number. But in this example, I identify my secondary source right at the beginning, so I don't have any parenthetical citation at the end. Literature works a little different. With primary sources, you're going to want to, if you're using an unpaginated primary text, you'll want to include paragraph numbers. And we'll talk about that, like I said, in part 3 of this series. So let's test your knowledge so far. How quickly can you spot the errors in these parenthetical citations? So I'll put up a number of examples on the right-hand side of the screen. You might pause with each one and try to figure out what's wrong with it, and then hit play and see the mistake. So here's the first one. The mistake here is that there should not be a comma after Anderson's name. Here's another one. Here, the writer forgot to put a space between the closing quotation marks and the opening parenthesis of the parenthetical citation. How about this one? No need to abbreviate pages. The P is unnecessary. Here's another one. With this one, periods and commas should be placed after the closing parenthesis, not inside the closing quotation marks. Here's another one. I see this one quite often, actually. Easy to miss when you're proofreading. It is the opening quotation marks. They are facing the wrong direction. So make sure that your opening quotation marks turn in the right way, right direction. How about this one? The error here is that the writer misspelled the source. Major no-no. How about this one? Actually, this one is correct. Okay, let's talk about using writers' names. When to use an author's first name. The first time you identify a source, it is okay to use the author's first and last name. After the author has been identified, however, use only the last name. If you cite multiple authors with the same last name, if it's a really common last name like Smith or Stewart or McCarthy, you may include first names to avoid confusing the reader, but you never identify a source by first name alone. So here in this example, I've identified Sherwood Anderson at the beginning, and from this point forward, I'll just use his last name, Anderson. Full name appears in normal order. Sometimes students would want to write last name, then first name, which is how it appears on the works cited page. No need to do that. Just normal word order is acceptable in the body of the essay. Let's talk about quotes within quotes. This often happens when writing about literature, and it confuses students, creates problems. Occasionally, you may want to quote a passage from a text that contains another quote inside of it. This is especially common when your primary sources contain dialogue. So, for example, here is a passage from the story Hands. This is from Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. And this passage appears on page 15 in that book. And I did not put quote marks around it. This is exactly how the passage looks in the book. Trembling lads were jerked out of bed and questioned. He put his arms about me, said one. His fingers were always playing in my hair, said another. So if you were going to quote this in a paper and you just used normal quotation marks, it would look like this. And I highlighted all the quotation marks in yellow. And I think you'll be able to see from looking at this creates a problem. If you just use standard quotation marks to cite this passage, you're going to confuse the reader about where the citation begins and ends. You've got two opening quotation marks in a row. It just becomes very muddled. So the solution is to replace the double quotation marks in the passage with single quotation marks. And this is one of the rare situations where using single quotation marks is appropriate. In fact, I can't think of another one off the top of my head. So sometimes students use single quotation marks to do all kinds of things. This is really the only time it's appropriate. And here's what it should look like. So I've got my opening quotation marks. They're the normal double quotation marks to begin the quote. But then once I get to the dialogue that's inside the quotation, I use the single quote marks to set that off. I think one reason that students get confused about this is if you're reading books that were printed in Great Britain, they do the opposite of the United States. They start with single quotes and then would have double quotes inside. So, for example, I've had students who are reading the British edition of Harry Potter where single quote marks are used, and in the American editions, it's double quote marks. Some other questions that come up: what if my quote ends with dialogue? Where do I put the single quotes then? And here's the answer. So if I ended my quote with the dialogue, I'm going to blow it up a little bit there. You see, I put in the single quotation mark followed by the double quotation marks, no spaces. Just, I know it looks kind of strange, but that is correct. What if you're just quoting dialogue? Do you still need to use single quotation marks? And the answer to that question is no, you do not. So if you look at my first example in here, you'll see that I've got the single quote marks, but that's inside of a quote, whereas my second quotation is just the dialogue. So because it's just the dialogue from that passage, I don't need to have the single quotation marks in the second example. If you look over here on the left in the original passage, just redundant to have the single quotation marks in the second example there. So let's talk about ellipses. The ellipsis allows the writer to eliminate unwanted text from the middle of a long quote. An ellipsis consists of 3 periods, each separated from its neighbor by a single space. The removal of unwanted words must not disrupt the grammatical integrity of the source material. I mean, it still has to read like a sentence. In many cases, particularly for beginning writers, I think it's just easier to break up long passages into smaller quoted units that can be integrated into your writing. We're going to talk more about integration in part 2 of this series. But sometimes you have to use an ellipsis. In most circumstances, you will never open or close a direct quote with an ellipsis. This is especially true if you're quoting prose. The exceptions to this occur when you're quoting lines of verse, and we'll talk about that in part 3. So in this example, I've got some material that I want to quote, but I want to eliminate. I think I'm eliminating the things I highlighted in yellow. So like, I want to quote this passage, but there's so much in there I don't need. Can I just get rid of some of it? The answer is I cut out the parts in yellow and just replace them with ellipses. That's how it's done. So how quickly can you spot the errors and the ellipses in these examples? Here's the first one. So again, no need to have ellipses at the beginning of or the ending. It's just one word. And here's another one for you to look at. The error here might be less obvious, but it's a spacing issue. You got to make sure that your ellipsis dots are separated from their neighbors and from the text by a single space. So I just took both those quotes that were wrong and created a passage where I am following the rules. So I have no ellipsis points, no ellipses around timidity, and I have properly spaced the ellipsis in the second quote there. Now we'll talk about the opposite of ellipses, and that's square brackets. Sometimes it is necessary for a writer to insert a word or words into a quotation to provide context or clarify meaning. Since this word is not the source's, it's not the writer's, it's necessary to identify the inserted material by enclosing it in square brackets. However, as with the ellipsis, the addition should not disrupt the grammatical integrity of the source material. Again, it may just be easier to avoid square brackets altogether by breaking up long passages into smaller quoted units that can be integrated into your writing. And again, we'll talk about integration later. So here I have added some words to a quote. So when you're reading the story, you do not see the words of Wing Biddlebaum in the text. I have added those to make it clear who the kneeling figure is. And to make clear that I've added those words, I have enclosed them in square brackets. Here's another solution where I don't use square brackets. I just break up the quote into smaller units, and that allows me to identify the figure without having to insert it into the quote with square brackets. This is called integration, and we will be talking about that in the second part of this series.